From the very beginning, long before the frostbite and starvation, and whispered acts of desperation that would one day stain the snow around their final camp, long before the men of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition were reduced to hollow-eyed shadows calling weakly for rescue in a collapsing shelter, the Arctic had already chosen its victims, because on the morning of August 7, 1881, as the steamship Proteus pushed north through drifting floes beneath a cold and indifferent sky, the seeds of tragedy were already settled in the ice, waiting for the moment when isolation, hunger, and winter would claim nearly all of them. It was a moment that looked deceptively calm as the ship sliced through the steel-colored water, its hull vibrating with each impact against floating slabs of ice, while the 34 men stood along the rail in stiff wool coats and watched the world they knew fade behind them, unaware that they were crossing an invisible boundary, one that marked the edge of safety, of rescue, of reasonable hope, and stepping into a region where nature answered to no human plan, and where the smallest miscalculation could snowball into catastrophe. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely stood at the bow, notebook tucked beneath his arm, the picture of discipline and quiet ambition. Yet even he felt a faint tightening in his chest as the first great icebergs drifted past like shattered white cathedrals, their towering faces glowing with a pale inner light. And although he would never admit it aloud, he sensed that the Arctic was not simply a destination, but a force that would test every conviction he carried and punish every flaw in ways he could not yet predict. As Proteus continued north, the air grew sharper, the silence heavier, and the men fell quiet as they realized the immensity of the world they were entering. A world where the vast horizon of ice and sky made even the ship, solid, warm, and alive, seem fragile. And though their mission brimmed with scientific purpose and patriotic pride, there was a subtle shift among them, a shared awareness that they were leaving behind the comforts of a world designed for human survival and stepping instead into a place that had never cared whether men lived or died. When the ship finally anchored at Lady Franklin Bay and began unloading crates of food, lumber, rifles, coal, and instruments, the men worked with energy and optimism, building the station they would name Fort Conger, convinced they would thrive here until relief arrived in 1882 and 1883. Yet as the last of the supplies touched the shore, the Arctic issued its first quiet warning, the ice behind Proteus closing with a deep, grinding rumble, as if sealing the ship's exit and marking a point beyond which return would not come easily. Moments later, when Proteus signaled its departure and began the long turn south, the men gathered on the shore and watched the ship shrink into a distant smudge of smoke, and though they waved and cheered, a hollow quiet settled in their chests, because they understood in some unspoken way that the vessel carrying warmth and safety and everything familiar was not merely sailing away, it was leaving them to the mercy of a continent that had already claimed stronger expeditions and would soon demand its due from them as well. Fort Conger rose from the frozen shore with planked walls reinforced by snow and earth, a sturdy refuge against the oncoming cold, and inside the structure, the men arranged bunks and instruments with meticulous order, unaware that the very routines they built to maintain sanity would one day become the brittle scaffolding barely holding their morale together as hunger hollowed out their strength and the long night crushed their endurance. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, and the world shifted into the strange blue half-light of autumn, the men gathered to watch the final sunset of the season, and though they spoke of data they would collect, adventures ahead, and the relief ships that would surely come, none of them could ignore the quiet dread settling over the camp, because the Arctic has a way of whispering truth to those who stand at its threshold, that once the light is gone and the darkness comes, survival becomes a narrow path where even strong men falter. Food dwindles too quickly, and hope thins into something fragile and easily broken. As the last warmth of autumn drained from the sky and the Arctic sun slipped lower each day in a slow, reluctant descent toward the horizon, the men at Fort Conger found themselves living inside a shrinking world, one defined not by distance or geography, but by the tightening grip of a cold so profound that it seemed to seep beneath their skin and settle somewhere deep within their bones, reminding them with every breath that they had crossed into a realm where human beings were never meant to linger. Greely, whose rigid faith and discipline served as both shield and burden, tightened the structure of the camp, into something resembling a military machine, insisting that the key to surviving the polar night was constant purpose. So the men woke each morning, if morning could still be called a time of day when darkness ruled 24 hours, and performed meteorological readings, tidal measurements, astronomical observations, and other scientific duties that filled their journals with numbers, even as the cold hollowed out their strength. Inside Fort Conger, the lamps glowed faint and amber, their light bending through frosted glass while the breath of the men condensed into crystals that clung to rafters like fragile lace. And although the stove burned steadily with coal and kindling, a creeping chill lingered beneath the floorboards and behind the walls, creating pockets of air so cold that touching the wood felt like pressing fingertips to stone. Talk among the men shifted slowly from enthusiasm to endurance, and although they continued joking at mealtimes and sharing stories of home, there was an undercurrent of tension in their conversations, a thin, fragile thread that trembled beneath the weight of the endless night, as they realized that the isolation was not merely physical but psychological, an erosion of certainty that made even the strongest minds feel brittle. The howling of the wind outside became a constant companion, sometimes moaning like distant voices, and other times striking the walls with a force so abrupt that men jolted awake in their bunks thinking the building was collapsing. And in that darkness, the Arctic seemed to press inward from every direction, testing their resolve not with sudden violence but with a slow, grinding pressure that wore away confidence grain by grain. Yet even in this oppressive environment, moments of triumph broke through the gloom, none greater than the extraordinary sledging expedition led by Lieutenant James Lockwood and the Inuit hunter Jens Edward, who pushed farther north across fractured floes and blue-tinted ridges than any humans in recorded history, returning with frostbitten faces and a banner of pride that filled the camp with a rare sense of accomplishment, as if their victory might somehow outweigh the hardships closing around them. But triumph in the Arctic is fragile, and the glow of Lockwood's success dimmed quickly as the months crawled on, and the men began marking the days not by sunlight, but by the slow depletion of their food stores, rationed carefully under Greely's stern watch as the calendar crept toward the expected arrival of the 1882 relief ship, whose provisions would replenish their larder and reaffirm their trust in the supply line that was the expedition's lifeline. When the bay remained empty throughout the summer and no ship appeared on the horizon, whispers began circulating among the men, first quietly and then with growing anxiety, as they speculated about storms or ice blocking the path. And although Greely maintained an outward calm, insisting that the relief had surely been delayed by circumstances beyond control, his journal entries grew more clipped, more guarded, betraying a rising fear that something had gone terribly wrong. The long winter that followed felt heavier than the last, not only because of the cold, but because uncertainty gnawed at the men with teeth sharper than hunger. And as the darkness reclaimed the sky, and the wind resumed its relentless assault on the station, the men lay awake listening to the rafters creak and wondering whether anyone outside the Arctic remembered them at all, or whether they were already considered lost. When 1883 arrived, and the second relief ship also failed to appear, the truth fell upon the camp like a sheet of ice cracking underfoot, and even the bravest men felt a shiver that had nothing to do with temperature, because now they understood with crushing clarity that their survival depended not on the storehouse at Fort Conger, but on a chain of decisions made thousands of miles away, decisions that had clearly not gone as planned. Greely gathered his officers and announced what he had long feared. They would have to abandon Fort Conger and travel south according to the written orders that required evacuation if relief failed 2 years in a row. And although this decision was presented as adherence to protocol, the men recognized the truth behind his words, which was that staying at Fort Conger meant starving slowly while waiting for ships that might never come. As they prepared to leave the station they had built with their own hands, packing sledges with the last of their supplies while the frigid wind tore at their faces, the men paused for one last look at Fort Conger, a structure that had sheltered them through triumph and hardship alike. And although no one spoke the thought aloud, each man sensed that once they stepped away from its walls, the Arctic would reveal its true cruelty in ways they had not yet imagined. With the sun barely skimming the horizon and the temperature plunging to levels that froze exposed skin in seconds, the men of the Lady Franklin Bay Expedition began their retreat from Fort Conger. unaware that the most difficult winter of their lives, and for many, the last they would ever endure, was waiting for them far to the south, where hunger, frostbite, conflict, and death would shape their fate with merciless precision. For many, the last they would ever endure was waiting for them far to the south, where hunger, frostbite, conflict, and death would shape their fate with merciless precision. The departure from Fort Conger felt less like a march and more like an exodus, because every man understood on some instinctive level that by abandoning the sturdy refuge they had built plank by plank, they were stepping into a world where the ice decided their fate. And as they lashed their sledges and boats with trembling fingers stiff from the cold, a silence settled over the group. A silence thick with fear, determination, and the unspoken question of whether any of them would ever see a warm horizon again. Greely's orders were clear and rooted in military discipline. Follow the regulations, move south, and reach the supply caches that were supposed to sustain them through the coming months. Yet as the expedition began its journey over a labyrinth of fractured floes and pressure ridges, even Greely felt an undertow of doubt pulling at him, because what the regulations promised in theory bore little resemblance to the physical reality of dragging heavy boats across ice that cracked, shifted, and buckled under their weight like brittle glass. The march unfolded in a brutal rhythm of exertion and collapse, with men leaning into their harnesses and hauling sledges over ridges that rose like frozen waves, their breath burning in their chests as frigid gusts tore at their faces, while beneath their boots the ice moaned and snapped in warning, forcing constant recalculations as they navigated a shifting wilderness where every step carried the possibility of disaster. More than once a man broke through a thin crust and plunged waist-deep into icy water, his comrades rushing to drag him out before the cold could seize his muscles and freeze him in place. And each of these incidents reminded the group that the Arctic did not need storms or predators to kill. It only needed a moment of inattention, a patch of weak ice, or a gust of wind at the wrong time. When the rare patches of open water appeared between sections of broken ice, the men climbed into their small boats and rowed with stiff, aching arms, navigating narrow channels bordered by walls of blue ice that towered above them like the ribs of some immense skeletal creature. And each time the current threatened to pull the boats against the jagged edges, they felt a fresh surge of fear knowing that a puncture would doom them all. The journey south was a ceaseless cycle of hauling, rowing, freezing, and enduring, and though the men tried to maintain a sense of purpose by chanting commands or sharing whispered encouragement, the strain etched itself into their faces as their bodies weakened and their patience frayed, slowly transforming their camaraderie into something taut and brittle. When at last they reached Cape Sabine, exhausted and half-starved, they approached the supply caches with a kind of desperate reverence, believing salvation waited inside the wooden boxes marked with the promise of food, fuel, and hope. But when they pried the lids open and saw only a pitiful fraction of what had been expected, an almost physical wave of despair swept through them, leaving several men speechless and others openly weeping as reality settled over them like heavy snow. Greely tried to maintain order, insisting that they could ration the limited supplies long enough for the next relief mission to arrive. But the men felt the truth in their bones. They had traded the shelter and relative abundance of Fort Conger for a place that could barely sustain them for weeks, much less the winter. And the small structure they built from driftwood, canvas, and snow, later christened Camp Clay, offered little protection against the cold that was already creeping south to overtake them. The rations that followed were precise to the point of cruelty, with each man receiving portions so small they scarcely filled the palm of a hand, measured in grams and crumbs and thin spoonfuls of broth. And though Greely enforced the rationing with unwavering discipline, the men could see the fear in his eyes each time he counted the diminishing stores, knowing he was performing arithmetic with their lives. As the cold tightened and ice storms lashed Camp Clay, the expedition's morale sank under the weight of exhaustion and hunger, and even the strongest men began showing signs of physical decline, trembling limbs, ghostly pallor, constant fatigue, while certain individuals grew irritable, suspicious, or despondent, their minds fraying at the edges as if starving bodies were pulling their thoughts into darkness. In quieter moments, when the wind softened and the camp settled into uneasy stillness, Some men spoke in hushed tones about the relief ships, their voices trembling as they wondered whether the vessels had been delayed, whether the Navy had lost hope, or whether they had simply been forgotten. And each time such doubts surfaced, the silence that followed was heavier than the cold itself. As the first deaths approached like distant storms, invisible until they were suddenly upon the camp, the survivors realized that their journey south from Fort Conger had not brought them closer to rescue, but had instead led them into the heart of an ordeal none had truly imagined. And although they continued living one day at a time, a dark understanding settled into their thoughts. The Arctic was not merely indifferent to their suffering, it was watching, waiting, and preparing to claim more of them in the months ahead. The Arctic winter returned with a ferocity that made the cold at Fort Conger seem almost merciful in hindsight, because at Cape Sabine, there was no thick-walled shelter to blunt the wind, no stocked storeroom to extend their hope, and no comforting routines to distract them from the slow, merciless erosion of their bodies as hunger hollowed them out day after day, leaving each man a little weaker, a little colder, and a little closer to the edge of surrender. Camp Clay, the fragile refuge built from salvaged driftwood, scraps of canvas, and blocks of snow, shuddered under the constant assault of gales that roared down the coast with such violence that the walls trembled like living things, and inside this cramped, frost-laced cavity, the men lay shoulder to shoulder on damp bedding, their breaths turning to frost that glittered under the dim lantern light like tiny crystals suspended in air. Rations dwindled with terrifying speed, reduced to portions so small that mealtime became an ordeal of the mind rather than nourishment. And although Greely assigned each man his share with strict military precision, the men could not help staring at the tiny fragments of meat, the thin broth made translucent by scarcity, and the crumbs of hardtack that dissolved into nothingness the moment they touched the tongue, leaving a hollow ache that never subsided. Starvation reshaped the men both physically and mentally, sharpening their bones until their faces took on the gaunt, haunted appearance of specters, and as their bodies weakened, their minds began to drift in troubling ways. Simple tasks required immense effort, concentration slipped like snow blown off a ridge, and conversations grew disjointed, as if their thoughts moved through molasses. The first deaths struck the camp not with drama, but quiet inevitability. Men whose strength had been too heavily taxed by previous journeys, or whose constitution simply could not endure the endless cold. And when a man finally stopped breathing, his comrades gathered around him, not with surprise, but with a resigned grief that felt like acknowledging the next stone in a tumbling avalanche, knowing their turn might not be far behind. The dead were carried outside the shelter and laid in shallow depressions on the snow, their bodies instantly stiffening in the cold, their faces preserved in expressions of peace, agony, or resignation. And over time, the row of frozen forms at the edge of camp grew into a silent congregation of the fallen, standing witness to the suffering within the collapsing shelter. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and portions of ears, the tissue turning black and brittle before breaking away with the slightest touch, and each time a man examined his injuries with numb detachment, he saw in the damage the cold logic of the Arctic. Anything that could not be warmed, moved, or nourished would be destroyed without hesitation. Amid this physical breakdown, tensions worsened, particularly around food. The one resource the camp understood with painful clarity was both essential and inadequate, and suspicions grew that some men were stealing from the ration bags, taking crumbs or slivers of meat in the dead of night, and these accusations ignited arguments that flared like sparks in dry timber, each one burning another piece of the fragile unity the group had once relied upon. The breaking point came with Private Charles Henry, whose repeated thefts forced Greely into a decision no commander should ever have to make: to execute a man under his command not out of anger or malice, but because the delicate balance of survival demanded it. And when Henry was shot on the ice outside Camp Clay, the sharp crack of the rifle echoed across the frozen bay like a warning from the Arctic itself that discipline and desperation were now indistinguishable. After Henry's execution, a heavy quietness settled over the remaining men, a quietness not of peace, but of shared trauma, as they realized that the Arctic had pushed them into a moral wilderness where decisions once unthinkable had become necessary tools of survival. And although no one spoke openly of it, each man wondered whether the camp had crossed an invisible line from hardship into something darker. Starvation deepened into something more feral, more consuming, as the days stretched into weeks and the men's bodies devoured their own muscle for fuel, leaving them trembling under blankets that no longer warmed them. And at night, when the wind softened and the camp fell eerily silent, some men whispered deliriously to themselves or cried out the names of loved ones, their brains flickering like lanterns in a storm. In the darkest weeks, rumors of cannibalism traveled through the camp in hushed, feverish murmurs, spoken by men who were themselves too weak to rise from their bedding. And although Greely forbade such acts with fierce determination, insisting that no sanctioned cannibalism would occur under his command, the boundary between law and instinct blurred as the dead multiplied and hunger distorted judgment, leaving the survivors to wonder what unseen acts might have occurred in the shadows of their desperation. Weakened beyond reason, some men drifted into hallucinations, visions of warm rooms, tables piled with food, familiar voices calling them home, and these delusions often arrive just before death, giving the dying a cruel glimpse of comfort that evaporated as the cold reclaimed them, while the survivors watched with hollow eyes, knowing they could offer no consolation except to place another stiffened body alongside the others. The Arctic night seemed endless, a suffocating void pressing against their fragile shelter, and although the men tried to track days in their journals, the entries grew shorter, more fragmented, and eventually incoherent, as if language itself were slipping from their grasp, replaced by a primal focus on breath, warmth, and the next ration that might or might not come. By early summer, those who remained alive lay in states so weakened that lifting a cup required tremendous effort, their cheeks sunken, their ribs visible beneath mottled skin, and yet somewhere inside their fading bodies flickered the stubborn spark of survival, the same spark that had driven explorers for centuries to push beyond the edge of the known world and confront the brutal indifference of the Arctic. They did not know that rescue ships were already fighting their own battle hundreds of miles to the south, nor could they imagine the struggle required to reach them, because all they saw when they looked outside the shelter was the same bleak coastline, the same frozen sea, and the same encroaching fog, while death circled closer with every passing hour, as if waiting for the moment when the last ember of life would finally extinguish. Far to the south of Cape Sabine, where the survivors of Greely's expedition lay skeletal and delirious inside their collapsing shelter, another struggle was unfolding across a landscape just as brutal, because the rescue mission charged with saving them, 3 ships under Commander Winfield Scott Schley, soon discovered that the Arctic had no intention of permitting passage without demanding its own toll in fear, endurance, and near constant danger. The flotilla consisted of the steamers Thetis and Bear, reinforced for polar service with thick hulls and powerful engines, accompanied by the older Alert, a relic of previous British Arctic ventures whose timbers had been seasoned by decades of frost. And as these vessels pushed northward from Upernavik, their prows met an ocean already hardening into a mosaic of broken panels, each floe drifting restlessly under the pressure of wind and tide like fragments of shattered glass sliding across a dark mirror. At first, the going was steady, with the ships threading their way through gaps in the ice, while Schley stood at the bow of Thetis, his gloved hands gripping the rail as he swept the horizon with binoculars. But as they advanced farther north, the leads narrowed, the floes thickened, and the once gentle collisions against loose ice became jarring impacts that reverberated through the hulls like muffled explosions, causing even seasoned sailors to flinch at the sound. Before long, the vessels found themselves trapped in a region of heavy pack ice, where pressure ridges rose like frozen waves, some towering higher than the masts, and each time the ships forced themselves into a crack between floes, the ice would seize them with grinding force, squeezing against the ribs of the hull with a creaking that mimicked the sound of a living creature groaning under unbearable strain, as if the Arctic itself were attempting to crush them for daring to intrude. Schley ordered men onto the ice with saws, picks, axes, and long poles, and the sailors worked in teams to carve channels through the pack, hacking and levering enormous slabs aside, while the frigid wind tore at their clothing and the ice beneath their boots trembled with unsettling vibrations. Yet they pressed on because they knew every hour lost could mean the difference between saving Greely's men or arriving only in time to recover bodies. When the pressure increased to dangerous levels, the ships resorted to the most harrowing tactic available. They tethered themselves to grounded icebergs with thick ropes and allowed the movements of these colossal frozen anchors to keep the pack ice from crushing their hulls. And during these tense periods, the crews listened to the thunderous groans of shifting floes as they slammed into the secured bergs, a sound as mighty as cannon fire echoing across the empty horizon. There were moments when all three ships were immobilized, imprisoned in a vise of solid ice that extended in every direction, and during these stretches the men lay awake at night listening to the timber frames shudder, imagining the worst-case scenario in which the pack cracked open beneath them and water rushed in faster than pumps could manage, swallowing ship and crew in a frozen grave. But Schley refused to retreat, making decision after decision with the same relentless determination that had guided polar explorers for centuries. Decisions that included abandoning any pretense of a comfortable schedule, forcing the ships forward in grueling shifts, and sending men out repeatedly onto the treacherous floes, always within sight of cracks that could widen unexpectedly and plunge entire teams into black, freezing water from which no rescue was possible. As they approached the latitude where Greely's party was believed to be starving, the ice became even more chaotic, with broken floes grinding against each other like tectonic plates and fog descending without warning to erase the horizon in minutes, forcing the helmsman to navigate by sound and instinct rather than sight. And every time the ships collided with a hidden pressure ridge, the shock traveled through the deck boards into the bones of every man aboard. The cold stiffened the ropes, froze the sails into rigid sheets, glazed the decks with treacherous ice, and numbed the sailors' fingers until they could scarcely feel the tools in their hands. Yet the men continued to work with near-fanatical diligence because they knew what lay ahead in Cape Sabine. A handful of survivors if they were lucky, or a cluster of corpses if they were too late. And no man aboard wanted to be part of a mission that returned with failure carved into its logbook. During one particularly violent episode, when a storm swept down from the north with a roar that drowned out even the grinding floes, the ships lost sight of each other in the swirling snow, and Thetis smashed against a hidden slab of ice that rocked her violently, sending sailors sprawling and nearly ripping the bow sheathing free. Yet the crew scrambled to reinforce the damaged sections with planks and iron bolts, fighting not only the cold but the terror of knowing that the Arctic had no mercy for a ship that lost its integrity. Through all these trials, Schley drove his men forward with a mixture of stern command, unyielding optimism, and the quiet urgency of a man who understood that the window for saving Greely was closing rapidly, and the sailors responded with a level of devotion rarely seen outside war, pushing themselves past the limits of exhaustion as they chipped, hauled, hacked, and prayed their way north through a gauntlet of ice that had destroyed countless expeditions before them. Finally, on June 22, 1884, after weeks of battling the unrelenting ice, the fog thinned just enough for the crew of Thetis to glimpse the stark outline of Cape Sabine rising from the frozen horizon, and as the ships crept closer through narrow leads, a lookout shouted that he saw a strip of canvas fluttering weakly on the shore, a movement so faint it might have been mistaken for wind alone. Yet every man aboard felt a surge of electricity course through him as the truth dawned. They had reached Greely's camp. The landing party moved across the ice with grim purpose, crunching over drifted snow, stepping around fragments of broken sledges, and passing shapes half buried under wind-sculpted drifts that resolved into the stiffened bodies of dead men. And as they approached the tattered shelter of Camp Clay, a faint, ragged voice drifted out from the shadows within, guiding them to the emaciated survivors who had clung to life far beyond what any doctor would have believed possible. In that moment, surrounded by the stark evidence of starvation and sacrifice, the sailors understood the magnitude of what they had achieved, not merely reaching Cape Sabine through a maze of lethal ice, but arriving in the final possible hours before the Arctic claimed the last of Greely's men. And the emotion that washed over the rescue party was not triumph, but a somber reverence for the cost these survivors had paid. The rescuers pushed aside the tattered canvas, expecting to find silence and stillness, yet instead, they were met by a whisper so faint it barely rose above the wind. "We are here. We are alive." and as their eyes adjusted to the gloom inside the collapsed shelter, they saw shapes stirring on the frozen ground. Not men in the ordinary sense, but skeletal figures wrapped in rags and furs, their faces hollowed into gaunt masks that seemed carved from wax, their eyes sunken yet burning with the final embers of human will. Lieutenant Adolphus Greely lay among them, gaunt and nearly unrecognizable, but still conscious and still commanding enough strength to speak. And when Commander Schley knelt beside him, Greely whispered through cracked lips the words he had held onto for months. "I order you to take us home," revealing that even after starvation and death had hollowed the expedition to its core, discipline and duty still formed the steel that held his mind together. Around him lay 6 survivors from the original 25 men, some unable to lift their heads, some drifting in and out of consciousness, all of them emaciated to the point where the rescuers could see the outline of bone beneath parchment-thin skin. And as the sailors moved carefully through the ruin of Camp Clay, they counted the bodies of the dead frozen where they had fallen, many still wrapped in the blankets where hunger had finally overtaken them. The grim inventory continued outside, where the wind swept across the cold gravel shore and revealed shallow graves that had partly eroded over the long winter, and the rescue team recorded the names of 14 dead in a place where the Arctic had granted no mercy, each grave representing a chapter of suffering that no survivor could ever fully describe. Yet the most chilling discovery came when the rescuers found bones that had been broken and cut in ways impossible to mistake. And although they understood instantly that cannibalism had been practiced in the final desperate weeks at Camp Clay, they also knew, from Greely's condition, from the survivors' statements, from the forensic arrangement of the remains, that the act had not been murder but a last, horrified attempt to keep death at bay in a world where starvation left no alternatives. The rescuers carried the survivors to the ships with a mixture of awe and heartbreak, because each emaciated man represented not just a life saved, but a battlefield of endurance, where mind and body had fought a war against hunger, frost, and despair. And every sailor who lifted a survivor in his arms felt the weight of something far heavier than a human body, the weight of an ordeal that would echo across naval history for generations. Commander Schley ordered immediate medical care, preparing warm broth in carefully controlled doses because the survivors' shrunken organs could not withstand sudden nourishment, and the ship's doctors worked hour after hour to stabilize men whose pulses fluttered like dying birds beneath their fingertips, knowing that even with rescue achieved, death still lingered close enough to claim more victims. As the ships turned south, threading their way back through the same treacherous ice that had nearly crushed them on the journey north, the rescued men lay in their bunks drifting between consciousness and dreams, murmuring names of comrades who had perished, recounting memories of Fort Conger, of hunger hallucinations, of the endless polar night, of choices no human being should ever be forced to make, while the sailors kept silent vigil, realizing they were witnessing the fragile boundary between survival and tragedy. News of the rescue spread throughout the ships with a current of subdued relief, but no celebration erupted because the men understood instinctively that this was not a triumphant expedition, but a retrieval from the jaws of oblivion, a mission in which success and sorrow were so tightly bound that no one could separate heroism from horror, and every sailor felt humbled by the endurance of the gaunt figures lying in the infirmary. When the rescue party reached Upernavik and then St. John's, telegraph messages raced ahead of them to the United States, where the public reacted with a mix of astonishment, grief, and morbid curiosity. And by the time the expedition reached Portsmouth, New Hampshire, crowds lined the harbor to welcome the survivors, not with jubilation but with reverent silence, as if greeting warriors returning from a war that no one had known was being fought. Lieutenant Greely, carried off the ship on a stretcher, weighed barely 90 pounds and could scarcely lift his head, yet he insisted on acknowledging his rescuers and addressed the assembled officers with a dignity that astonished onlookers. And although his voice quavered, it carried the authority of a man who had upheld discipline even when dying men around him questioned the point of continuing to live. In the weeks that followed, a storm of controversy erupted as investigators examined the cannibalized remains recovered from Camp Clay, and newspapers sensationalized the horror with lurid headlines. Yet throughout the inquiries, one fact stood immovably at the center of the narrative. Greely had maintained strict orders against any killing for food, and the combination of forensic evidence and survivor testimony proved that cannibalism occurred only after death, when starvation left no path except the one every civilization hopes never to discuss. Despite the public fascination with the gruesome details, the true story of the Greely Expedition was not defined by its darkest moment, but by the extraordinary endurance that allowed 6 men to survive, where every mathematical calculation said they should have died, and as the survivors slowly regained strength in military hospitals, they were honored not for the tragedy that had unfolded, but for the discipline, loyalty, and resolve that had carried them through a crucible of suffering, matched only by the harshness of the Arctic itself. Greely himself recovered slowly, his hair whitened by deprivation and his health permanently damaged, yet he was promoted to captain and eventually to brigadier general, a recognition not only of his leadership during the expedition, but also of the dignity with which he endured the aftermath, never exploiting the horror for personal fame, never diminishing the courage of the men who had followed him into the north. In time, memorials were erected to honor the victims of the expedition, their names carved into stone so that future generations would understand that exploration often demanded a price measured not in miles traveled, but in human lives surrendered to forces beyond control. And the Greely Expedition became a case study in survival, leadership, logistical failure, and the unforgiving nature of the polar world. Historians would eventually describe the rescue of 1884 as one of the greatest maritime retrievals ever attempted, praising the determination of Commander Schley and his crews, and recognizing that without their impossible push north through some of the worst ice in recorded memory, Greely's party would have vanished entirely, leaving behind only frozen remains and unanswered questions. In the decades that followed, the survivors lived with memories that could never fully fade. Dreams of cracking ice, of starvation, of the endless night broken only by the howling of the wind across the barren gravel shore of Camp Clay. And though they rebuilt their lives, each carried within him a private scar shaped by the knowledge that survival had come at the cost of comrades who had endured the same suffering, but had not lived to see the rescue ships appear through the fog. The Greely Expedition would be remembered as both a dark survival epic and a heroic tragedy, a story in which bravery and suffering intertwined until they were indistinguishable, and its legacy endured because it revealed the limits of human endurance while also proving that sometimes, when all hope seems lost, rescue can still arrive in the final hours before death's final claim. And for those who study the Arctic today, the lesson echoes still across the polar winds, that the North is a place where ambition must bow to nature, where survival demands both discipline and luck, and where the line between life and death can narrow to a single beating heart, waiting for the sound of footsteps in the snow.